Hi, Damon.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Good. Good to be here.
Good to have you. Let me introduce us. You've been with us before. You're Damon Linker, columnist for The Week.
Indeed.
Also an author of a couple of books, The Theocons and The Religious Test. And you are you a former Theocon? You're a former something.
Well, I guess you could say I was a moderate neocon around the time before I got to First Things, and then
First Things being the conservative journal where you worked for some time.
Yeah, the kind of if the Theocons are a thing, that's their magazine, or it was.
It's a magazine of a religious and conservative orientation.
Yeah.
But now you're at The Week, and you've written a piece that led me to ask if you wanted to talk about it and related matters. It's about the coronavirus, and it is called "Trump May Lose the Battle with the Coronavirus, but Nationalists Will Win the War." The suggestion being that this will not, the coronavirus crisis will not exert a unifying effect on the world. There's a related question at the domestic level. You know, is this going to tear us apart as a nation or bring us together? I think they're kind of related. So I'd like to talk about both of these questions. But first, I wanted to ask you just how you're feeling about things different in general about the virus. I should say that we're taping this on Friday. It probably won't run till Sunday or Monday, and things are moving very fast on the coronavirus front. It seems like only days ago there was not a massive freak out about it. I think the freak out has been largely good, actually, but it is a freak out. How are you feeling?
Pretty freaked out. I mean, I'm not personally afraid really about getting sick and it killing me. But I do have two children. They're in the schools here in the Philadelphia suburbs. We've been through the experience the last few days of a kind of cascading of cancellations in their lives and in our lives and all Americans' lives, where, you know, as of yesterday, Governor Wolf in Pennsylvania declared a state of emergency where we live in Montgomery County, which meant that the schools had to shut down. So now my daughter's looking at 2 weeks home. Then my son, who goes to a private school near here, that has now happened to him too. My daughter is a ballerina and dances, and her school is now shut down. The market's tanking. The president declared a national emergency today.
Did you not check in today after the market has recovered virtually everything it lost yesterday?
Yeah, it has, but that won't continue.
Probably won't. It was, it's funny. I don't know if half of the rebound happened because of this little thing Trump did at the very end of the day. I don't know if did you watch that?
I saw parts of it and followed other parts of it on Twitter.
It's funny. I was watching the market as he did it, and at first he started talking, and the market was tanking. It was dropping. It had made a partial rebound today, and it was just dropping because he was doing the usual thing, like, I'm great, I saw this coming. Some call it, you can call it talent or luck. You know, it's like, shut up. And finally, he gets to the point, which is that, among other, he declared an emergency, and apparently tests he thinks are going to be much more widely available, and then the market felt its optimism return.
And then he brought out a series of CEOs who are the kind of the power people on Wall Street. And so that made the markets very, very happy. Look, private-public partnership for the sake of the country. Yay, we're going to beat this thing.
CVS, Walgreens, Walmart, which apparently is going to have, as I understand, what they're going to use their parking lots for drive-through testing centers?
Something like that. Yeah. There'll be parking lots available. Yeah. I mean, my concern on the financial side is just that the demand collapse that this is going to represent is kind of unprecedented. We've never really seen an economy the size of ours and then the economy of the world potentially just kind of hit full stop. Just this afternoon before Trump spoke, Delta Airlines released a statement about what it's going to do. It's going to cut 40% of its flights. It's going to put a whole large percentage of its fleet basically in mothballs. That's a huge ramp down in one business. Now multiply that by all the airlines and then across huge segments of the economy. I don't see how this doesn't lead to either a massive recession or something even worse, like the big D.
It depends on how long the problem lasts and whether we get it under control. I mean, I will say so technically there have been three things happen. First was a hit on the supply side when the supply chains from China got slowed by China's version of the problem. Then You're right. The precautions you take hit us on the demand side. They reduce the amount of spending in various sectors, and that problem has certainly accelerated over the last few days as our regional theater here, not to mention Broadway, shutting down. Concerts are kind of ending. Meetings are ending. I think people in certain areas like New York are going to be going to restaurants less. There's all of that. And then the third thing, so there's demand, there's supply. And then the third thing is the effect of people's portfolios dropping on Wall Street and how that affect, even if the average American, for them it's basically a retirement account. I mean, the average American who has much money in Wall Street to begin with, it could affect your thinking about how much you can afford to spend. So we'll see. But a big question is how rapidly do we get the problem under control? And I have to say, I've gotten more optimistic as a result of the freakout. We are dramatic measures are being taken. Almost none of them as a result of political guidance, but just it's been fascinating to see how it's like a leaderless resistance against the coronavirus. It's like and social media was deeply involved, and putting pressure on various institutions and so on, and some politicians at the state and local level have acted. But are you not kind of impressed?
I am impressed, but we're so in the dark about how many people even have the virus because there's been so little testing that I almost feel like I can't give you an answer to the question of how quickly we'll be able to kind of, as they say, bend the curve or flatten the curve, because we don't know what the curve is. We're using data based on a tiny, minuscule number of tests. Mm-hmm. So once we start getting a serious number of tests done on sick people and actually have an accurate gauge on where we are in that graph that we keep seeing from all the affected countries, then I'll feel more like I might be able to make a prediction. But at the moment, I feel sort of blind. And for instance, last night, Post Malone, this, big pop star, had a big arena concert in Denver. The whole place was full. And, a journalist posted pictures from it. And in the responses on Twitter, a lot of people were contemptuous. Yeah, of course people are going out there. What are they afraid of? Come on. Who cares? What's the big deal? Americans, unlike some of the Asian countries where they have had very effective public health responses to this, Americans are, by kind of disposition, very suspicious of authority. And so, we'll see, once we have those tests done, we'll see what areas of the country, where is it worse than others? Now it seems like it's worst on the coast where you'd expect, where there's higher population density and more people come from foreign countries that might have been affected, and they spread it, and now it's going throughout. Right. But, was that stupid that Post Malone's concert wasn't canceled? I don't know. How many cases are there in the Denver area? Maybe there are hardly any, and so it didn't matter. But again, I just don't know. Yeah,
but I would say I do assume that we are becoming aware of people who die because of it, right? You would think that if somebody actually dies because of it, they at least managed to get a hold of a test, or at least there's some diagnostic capacity that makes it kind of clear what happened. And if that's the case, then we do, in a sense, have access to the bottom line. And the fact is, not that many Americans have died of it, if I'm right in that assumption. Now, it's true that that's a short-term view. I mean, to figure out what the death rate is going to be 7 days down the road, you need a better idea of how far it is spread. That's all true. Yeah. But it seems to me it's just kind of clearly not not out of control. And these are dramatic measures being taken. And maybe not all of them are ill-advised. I mean, maybe in some of the college student bodies that are disbanding, maybe there are cases where actually it's spread among them already, and now they're going to carry it far and wide. Who knows? Maybe some of these things aren't smart, but it's a lot of things are happening that I do think will definitely reduce the.
They certainly will help. You know, if your baseline is if we were going along doing nothing, then obviously what we're doing now will ultimately lower the affected rate and therefore the fatality rate. So that's all to the good. Yeah.
I also think, you were saying Americans are suspicious of authority and they're not taking may not take the problem so seriously. But actually, I think, and this gets us to the question of whether the nation is divided. As someone noted days ago, there's a big divide if you look at Trump supporters and Trump opponents in terms of how serious they think this is. Now, this is back when Trump was saying it wasn't serious, and he's kind of changing his tune. So that may change, but it's interesting. There are two possible explanations for that. One is the standard psychology of tribalism explanation. Your guy is Trump. He said it's not a problem. And now he's being ridiculed by liberals who say it is a problem. That's all the more reason to double down and side with him. That's one explanation. But it's also true that the virus has hit the blue states heavier and the blue parts of states heavier, right? The big states have been New York, California, Washington State, and within states, I assume, it's been more of an urban thing. And, it's a cosmopolitan thing, right? I mean, the first people to get it are going to be people who go travel around the world on jets. And so, maybe two things are changing. Trump is starting to take it seriously, and it is starting to spread to more and more regions. So those two things, either one of those could change attitudes.
Well, certainly Trump taking it seriously is encouraging. I mean, people were really attacking his 10-minute address the other night, which I agree in all kinds of ways was disastrous because he misstated important facts and, sort of was off topic in all kinds of ways. But I, at least while watching it, was slightly placated and relieved for this very reason. Like, okay, however he might be screwing this up, at least he's finally talking as if this is a real thing. It's not a hoax. It's not fake news. It's not just Democrats are trying to take me down by making up this problem. So that in and of itself meant some progress. And then the national declaration of the emergency declaration today, I think will do more even. Although, we also are dealing with, the Chicken Little problem on a couple of dimensions. One is that, Trump already declared a national emergency over the southern border. And he's kind of always talking in terms of, I want to declare a national emergency because that'll free up funds and allow him to circumvent Congress for various things. So on that note, it's not even the first national emergency of the Trump presidency. On the other, you have the fact, and I think this plays into some Republican suspicion, is that, let's be honest, Democrats have been in a state of kind of high anxiety agitation for more than 3 years now, since the last election. And there have been a lot of crisis announcements, from, all the things about things Trump's doing, Russia, and a lot of that, I think, being kind of amplified by conspiratorial thinking that then hasn't been fully verified by the Mueller report or by other investigations. And then, this is obviously a big thing, climate change, which has a similar dynamic in that, obviously, you and I agree. Climate change is real. It's important. It's going to have huge impacts. But most Americans are very kind of commonsensical in their perception of the world. And the average American is like, you know what? I've been vacationing in South Carolina for my whole life, and I go down there and the ocean's exactly where it's always been. This is all a bunch of BS, this climate change stuff. And like, that's all they need to say or hear. And so to the extent that the red states haven't seen sick people, they look at this and they're like, what is this nonsense those Democrats are doing again? This isn't a problem. You're always saying it's a crisis. And it just this, again, a kind of suspicion of the media, of authorities, public health people, and all that.
I think that's true. I mean, I think the kind of predictable liberal reaction to how lackadaisical Trump was about the problem, which was to scream about how irresponsible and stupid he is, which, I think there was a fair foundation for criticizing him. He wasn't taking it seriously enough. But the predictable high volume denunciation of him, coupled with the warning that this was serious, I'm sure only had the effect, on balance had the effect, of making his supporters take it less seriously than they might have. I think that was happening at first. And one question is, is that going to change now for the reasons I suggested? But it certainly was a study in how tribalized we are and how polarized we are.
Yeah, everything that happens tends to get sucked up into the kind of the siloed kind of epistemology where everything that the other side says confirms your assumption about how wrong and screwed up they are. And it's bad. Now, this isn't the column that you invited me on to talk about, but my more recent column that posted today talked about that aspect a little bit. And briefly, my claim is that, and my hope is that people, like, one thing that could help to disperse this a little bit is if people realize, like, the liberals who were up in arms about this virus weren't completely crazy. The sky was a little bit falling. This is dangerous. This was real. This wasn't just alarmism. You weren't just trying to take down the president who I like, and so forth. And that kind of where the rubber meets the road, where like actually it's not just conflicting narratives, but actually is about a shared reality we all inhabit. That is exactly the kind of jump start to kind of a willingness to talk and understand and agree on certain common aspects of the world that we live in.
So you think this could lead us into more of a shared reality?
Maybe, but the sad thing about it is the likelihood of that will increase the worse it is.
Exactly.
And also the way the worse it is. David Brooks's column in the Times today sort of talked about the history of epidemics and how they tend to shred the social fabric as it gets worse because people become more kind of protective of themselves and not wanting to help outsiders because they're too worried about catching it and so forth. So people become hyper selfish. And so that's why I don't know how any of this is going to play out.
And there's also the irony that if the alarmists are right and it's a big problem, then the alarm they're generating is appropriate. But it may actually help solve the problem, short circuit the problem, right? And so they will have been right, and the alarm they generated will have succeeded in stopping the problem before it got out of hand. But they will seem to have been discredited because they got all alarmed, and then it wasn't a huge problem. It kind of reminds me. Do you remember Y2K? For our younger viewers, as the millennium approached, as the year 2000 approached, people started going, wait, there are all these computers that were programmed assuming that this year would never come. They just have 2 digits signifying the years. It's like 94, 95, 96. And once we get to 2000, there will be this huge crash and blah, blah, blah. And so all this money was spent to deal with a problem, and then not much happened, and people said, well, the alarmists were wrong. Well, I don't know. Actually, the alarm led a lot of people to spend a lot of money, fixing the problem, and maybe that's the reason. And it's the same kind of thing where the alarmists may be right, and yet their rightness will discredit them in this ironic way.
Exactly. Yeah, I tweeted about that last night, about the tragedy of public health, that the more effective the public health measures are, the fewer people who will get sick and die, and that will lead then the critics to say, see, why did you guys get so upset about this? This was nothing, grow a pair, that kind of thing. But the fact is that's a major issue in all of politics. I mean, you could say the same thing. Like, I bet there's some people from the George W. Bush administration who would be like, oh yeah, you're getting on me about Iraq and torturing people and all that stuff we did. But if we hadn't done that, we would have had another 9/11 in 2005. And then then you'd be really upset and say you dropped the ball. So you can always, whenever the government does a big action to try to prevent a bad thing from happening, if it doesn't happen, that can then be marshaled into evidence that you shouldn't have tried in the first place.
Well, but it's not always the case. I mean, the distinctive thing about this is this. I mean, with a lot of problems, first of all, you say there's cause for alarm, and that alone doesn't do anything about the problem, and you demand that the government act. And if it doesn't act and nothing happens, well, then you probably were wrong, because the only tools to address it were government tools. The government didn't listen to you, and there was still not a problem. This is an unusual situation where, yeah, the government might do things. It is doing some things. But one thing we're learning, I think, is that a tremendous amount can happen at a grassroots level. Mm-hmm. And I don't think it was always like this. But again, partly because of social media. In a way, it's the same phenomenon that, in a way, helped Trump get the nomination to begin with, even though Republican leaders didn't want it. We're living in an age when new media, among other things, undermine the authority of institutions or allow people to circumvent the authority. And I think there's a connection here where we just are crowdsourcing the problem. It's like, okay, you're not doing anything. We're going to talk about it on social media, put pressure on institutions and other politicians, and it's going to happen. That's different, from the kind of classic problem where, I guess I made the point where you're worried about something, only the government can solve it. They do nothing. If the problem doesn't transpire, you look perhaps rightly like an idiot. Yeah,
but what you said about kind of what's going on in civil society, it's true. Like Scott Gottlieb, who's a well-respected public health guy, he's been on TV a lot. And, the fact that he's on TV wall to wall talking the way, say, a representative of an imagined third Obama term public health official would talk, has probably had a big influence on people like Governor Wolf in Pennsylvania, who then acted to shut down my daughter's school because Montgomery County, where I live, has the most cases in Pennsylvania. So in a way, it's kind of good old American federalism. So the states are doing their thing and leaving the federal government to kind of figure out what exactly it's going to do. But people closer to the ground, both in civil society and at lower levels of the federal structure, are acting in responsible ways. And so in that way, maybe like Trump is, behind the curve a little bit here, but at least now he's at least moving and can help to maybe jumpstart some of the things that only the feds can do.
It would be an interesting experiment to go back and have him react the opposite way and then see how liberals reacted. If he's like, I'm declaring an emergency. I mean, you got a little of that with him excluding flights from China. Yeah. Right. And I think even Joe Biden probably, in a way that's not going to help him politically, dismissed that as, xenophobic fear-mongering or something, when in fact I think it actually had the support of kind of knowledgeable health people in the administration. But suppose Trump had gone whole hog. Declaring an emergency, we're closing the schools, and ordered all the stuff that's been done with the support of a lot of liberals. I'm not sure.
I think probably it what could be happening is he could have gotten on the aspects. I don't even know enough about the government to know exactly what he would have had to do, but make sure the tests get out there and disseminated throughout the country, and that if you're sick, you can get tested like you do with a throat culture for strep throat.
Right.
Like, make it routine. If he had done that 2 months ago, that would have definitely helped. I doubt any president would have done much more than that prior to about 2 weeks ago when this really hit Italy. Because at the beginning, people didn't know if this could be contained to China. You know, China's an authoritarian country. They completely quarantined the Wuhan province and had a total lockdown, stopped the supply chain, shut down factories, set everyone into isolation. And as I recall, my own reaction to watching the news as this unfolded through early February, I know a lot of smart people were sort of like, well, we got to see, like, can this be contained? Mm-hmm. And then next thing you know, there are cases in South Korea and Taiwan and Singapore and then in Europe. And then when it really hit Italy bad, I think that's when maybe we should have seen some of these measures begin, because then it became clear that we were heading toward pandemic. So I don't criticize Trump that much for the latter delay. I mean, would have been better a couple weeks ago. Mm-hmm. The one thing I'm very critical of him on is the testing and how he seems to have made it known in the government that I don't want a lot of tests because I don't want bad news because it'll be bad for my reelection. And that's, like, wildly irresponsible.
Well, I don't know. Do we really have evidence that he did something quite that bad?
Well, there was a cruise ship
thing where the way he spoke seemed to imply he didn't want to let people off the cruise ship because then we'd have to count them or something. But,
there was a front page story in the Times 2 days ago on Wednesday of this week, I believe, about some of this, about how he did not want more testing done. And that it was tied to bad news that would hurt his reelection prospects, which for someone who's informed about public health sounds like psychotic behavior, because it implies that he thinks if we don't get the information, it isn't real. But then again, this is the guy who wrote The Art of the Deal. I mean, this is a guy who spent 30 plus years believing that he can manipulate the world with lies and kind of warp it to his will.
No, I think
he might believe that. I mean, has he been tested? He hung out with Bolsonaro and his staff last weekend at Mar-a-Lago. They have the coronavirus. I mean, it's unclear, I guess, still whether Bolsonaro has had the double positive confirming test yet. But he had one initial test that came back positive, and then his press guy has definitely come down with it. And they sat with the president last weekend. Is it possible that Donald Trump believes that if he doesn't get tested, he won't get sick? I actually think it's possible. Maybe
he has been tested and doesn't want to say that he got the test when lots of Americans can't or something.
Yeah, but that's possible.
He's definitely somebody who I think very rarely sets out to actually solve a problem. His first thought is always, how can I look like I'm solving the problem?
Yeah.
And there is that. Related to this testing thing, there is one mystery I really want to hear resolved, which is that the WHO had a test and dozens of countries made use of it. And somewhere in the American government, a decision was made not to make use of the WHO test. And I want to know where that decision was made. I would not put it, I mean, there's a number of theories. Could it be just mid-level bureaucratic screw up? Could be that the test had downsides. But I wouldn't put it past Trump to have the instinct, and in a way this takes us to your nationalism argument, to have the instinct, hey, we're America, we're going to solve this. We're not going to have some global governance institution tell us how to solve a problem, right? I mean, I would not put it past him and some people in his administration, but I really want to know what the story is there.
Yeah, I'm sure there will be investigations of it. But of course, if the Democrats lead them, then no one on the right will
give us the witnesses, right?
Yeah.
So talk about your argument that this is going to strengthen nationalism.
Sure. I'll summarize it for you and then kind of add a caveat to show like the way I think about things when I do my punditry is usually it's not so much about predictions as about talking about possible paths that could happen. And this column that I'm talking about talks about one of them, but there are other paths that I concede could be almost equally possible. So my argument is pretty simple, that what we've seen since, say, the end of the Cold War, the kind of march toward a globalized world with relatively open markets, with kind of universal humanitarianism kind of dominating elite thinking, both in the United States and through Western Europe, through international institutions and, ethical thinking at the university level around the world, that all of this together was sort of a product of a moment, namely the post-Cold War moment, where it seemed like, well, we defeated communism, the Fukuyama argument about the end of history, that somehow we're now kind of in a safe world. We're just going to buy and sell with each other. We're not going to have wars of aggression. We'll have wars occasionally on the periphery to punish the recalcitrant nations who won't come along with the liberal international order and its plan for kind of global harmony at the kind of basic level. Mm-hmm. And that was the hope, and that lies behind a lot of thinking about how we order our lives, and that this order has received a series of body blows since 9/11, with first 9/11. The historian Tony Judt famously, he wrote a column in the New Republic right after it was written, I think the morning of 9/11, and the lead line of that column was, I looked out my New York University office window and saw the 21st century begin. Meaning seeing those planes hit the World Trade Center was the beginning of a new century with a whole different range of problems.
I just want to inject one thing. This is an example where too much fear does hurt, right? Mm-hmm. The way we responded to that, that was a classic case where kind of what you could call natural human fears and the natural amping up of them makes the problem worse. Not everyone agrees about that, but, we invaded Iraq. We did, most of the terrorism that wound up happening on U.S. soil, that had anything to do with Islam, that was, Islamist, jihadists, whatever you want to call them, they were people complaining about the Muslims we were killing abroad in Iraq and Afghanistan and other places. So this is a classic. I just want to distinguish that from the current situation where the fear is by and large, healthy in terms of solving the problem. It can get out of hand and we can do, but
sure,
that's
I agree.
That's exactly the kind of thing I meant to contrast it with. So anyway, go ahead.
I agree with you. I mean, we're largely in agreement, I think, on foreign policy issues. Yeah. And I thought we needed to invade Afghanistan to get the Taliban, and because they wouldn't give up Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda, and they did directly attack us. But after that, I totally opposed the Iraq War and a lot of what came after that. Mm-hmm. I think it's been a disaster, and that it was largely an overreaction. But nevertheless, it did inspire a lot of fear. Then you had the financial crisis of 2008, which kind of made international finance, which had grown to play such a major role in the economies of the world, to really get a bad name. And there was all of this kind of left populist blowback against the fact that there were bailouts of the big, huge, too big to fail banks.
Although a lot of that was a reaction against elites at the national level. I mean, the 1997 Asian financial crisis was almost a clearer example of the globalization of risk per se, because to Americans, I mean, the truth is the 2008 crash, it started in America. I mean, more than anywhere else, right?
Of course. But that in and of itself, I mean, a lot of what my argument has to do, especially I think even more than here, with Europe. So I'll get to that. So then we had that. Then we had the refugee crisis in Europe, which ended up, giving a kind of rocket fuel to a bunch of nascent right populist movements throughout the continent that have ultimately given us.
But that itself, you wouldn't call the refugee crisis itself, you wouldn't call an expression of globalization, would you? I mean, in my mind, it was an expression of what happens when we and our allies send a bunch of weapons into Syria and amp up a civil war that otherwise.
No, I agree with that as a foreign policy issue of what caused the refugee crisis. But I'm talking about how
it's perceived.
How it is perceived by people who are like, wait a minute, no, Angela Merkel, I don't want 1 million people from Syria coming into Germany and living here because we have a Kantian duty to open our borders.
No, it was a nationalist reaction. Brexit might not have happened but for the refugees.
Right. But Brexit, the Alternative for Germany party, which is very right wing, and Trump, and Bolsonaro, and Orban kind of having his rebirth as an anti-liberal demagogue, and all of it. So all of those body blows to this kind of liberal international universalist order have happened. And now my argument is that because of the fear, justified in a lot of ways, of what is happening now is likely to contribute to that. And then a second point on top of that is the likely economic consequence of it, because it's likely to lead to very serious economic contraction. And note that everything I just described, especially the refugee crisis and the rise of all these right-wing populist parties, have happened in a time of relative economic growth, not great growth. Some countries have still been kind of mediocre, especially in Europe, but it's still not been a moment of deep recession. So what happens to those movements when suddenly we actually have a major economic dislocation, plus the fear of outsiders bringing this deadly contagion? Those are all ingredients that could very well amp up the nationalism that we've seen. Now, again, I'll stop and let you, chat about that with me a little bit, but I do have a couple of additional things I'd want to add to it.
I guess I'd say two things. I mean, one is just a question I'd ask: how much of that have we actually seen? We've seen, acts of generosity. I mean, I heard today that Jack Ma, the Chinese billionaire, is donating half 1,000,000 tests to the U.S. and some huge number of surgical masks. Maybe I have the number wrong. There's been a certain. I haven't seen. I
haven't seen it yet. I mean, it's just started.
So, the other thing I'd note is, and this is not necessarily something you disagree with, is I'd say, the irony is global epidemics. I mean, first of all, unless you just stop globalization in its tracks to such an extent that that's probably going to be long-term bad news economically, unless you just kind of, bring us back to a simpler era, lacking much of the international commerce and travel and so on, then the rational response to the reality of pandemics is to actually take more concerted effort at the global level. The World Health Organization should be a robust organization, and so on and so on. So that doesn't stand in contradiction to your claim that that's not what will happen, right? That the forces of nationalism will prevail, but it is the logical response, unless, again, you just want to kind of, you think you can almost reverse globalization, which I don't think is doable at an acceptable cost. I'm in favor of slowing it down, I must say, in certain ways that I needn't get into, but I don't think you're going to reverse it or stop it.
No, I think you're probably right, although, and you're right, I think, about the rationality of, say, the WHO, should be even stronger than it is and bigger than it is and better funded than it is in light of this. But then again, you and I are not marching in defense of, Bolsonaro's movement or Orban or the Law and Justice in Poland. So this isn't something that appeals to me, but I do think it's a risk going into a new era of economic contraction and fears of contagions and so forth. Now, again, let me add my complication. One has to do with another dimension of the issue, which has to do with competence. So some of the nationalists on the scene, very much including Trump, are not really competent at governing. And so, if all the nationalists prove themselves to be bumbling idiots who actually can't fight this competently, then the technocrats around the world, like say Macron, if Macron can really stem the virus in France and look better than Italy, then that could boost him. I mean, domestically, I think Andrew Cuomo's been doing pretty well so far in kind of taking a more aggressive stance toward the virus in New York. And even Netanyahu in Israel is kind of trying to portray himself as a kind of like highly competent technocratic nationalist.
He shouldn't be in prison.
Yes, exactly. He's trying to always bolster his approval ratings for that reason.
He has been, because if he's been indicted, and if he can remain prime minister, he doesn't have to face the
exactly.
music.
So that's one thing. But that could mean either that my prediction about nationalism surging could actually be instead, maybe we'll see a kind of reversion to kind of 1990s style technocratic governance. Mm-hmm. But it could also be both. Maybe only nationalists who actually are good at governing you could get technocratic nationalists and they'll succeed. Certainly Orban likes to portray himself as someone like that too. But then there's another dimension that I do a podcast once a week with some of the Bulwark people, titled, Beg to Differ.
Now are they never Trump conservatives?
Yeah. Well, the Bulwark is, but the people on the podcast are two center right people and two center left, and the center left is me and Bill Galston from Brookings. Mm-hmm. And Galston made a point in our podcast the other day that right along these lines that was good and deals with the issue of supply chains that you mentioned earlier. Mm-hmm. I mean, he pointed out that all of this, the virus and so forth, could kind of bolster the position of the kind of localist movement that you see kind of bubbling up around, like, local sourced vegetables and fruits and meats. And what if companies decide, the disruption to our supply chains from this event shows that the increased efficiency that we get by globalizing the supply chains actually, in the event of these sort of occasional black swan bad events, show that actually maybe we should prize the resiliency of our supply chains by making them more local and sacrifice a little efficiency that ends up leading them to be highly vulnerable.
I think companies almost never think that long term. If these things happen more frequently, it would be one thing. But if you're a CEO who wants to maximize the price of your stock, you're not giving any thought to something that might happen in another 20 years or another 10 years, I think.
Well, that's certainly true, although it would be...
a demand for this kind of thing could be created. People may, respond to this by I don't know, but I'm a little skeptical, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's a possible. This is what I meant by possible paths that I don't know what's going to happen. There are way too many variables and uncertainties, but there are these different options. So, like pure nationalism of any variety, technocratic nationalism, a kind of contraction of globalization on the business side to kind of bring back to within the sphere of individual countries the supply chains to allow products to be created, built, and sold, so that we're not as vulnerable to a kind of catastrophic breakdown like we've had in China. I mean, we have outsourced a huge amount of our economy to China, and if China goes offline, we have the supply hit. But as we've talked about already, we're dealing with a huge demand side hit now too. So maybe in the end, the fact that we can't get products from China won't matter because no one will want to buy anything for a while. It's a little unclear.
Could be. Now, there's something I said earlier, I think kind of supports your argument or potentially works in synergy with it, which is just that, if you look at the political tensions within a country like America right now, there would be a natural tendency for Trump supporters to look at where this thing entered the country, right? California, Washington State, New York. These are the big hot spots. Boston to some extent, I guess, and say, well, who brought it in? It's these damn cosmopolitans that are the enemy nationally. And why did it come in? Because they are connected to the world, and they're flying back and forth to Europe. and to Asia. So I would think, and I would imagine I imagine there's a similar kind of internal national dynamic in some of these European countries with somewhat robust right-wing nationalist movements. And that would tend to, so there's a kind of interplay between the tribal logic of domestic politics, and ultimately broader tensions, I guess, in the world, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I mean, I would definitely be watching the League, the party in Italy, the far right party that was, in a coalition government with a 5-star movement until a few months ago when it fell. Yeah.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's northern Italy where the big outbreak is, and that is the more affluent part and presumably the more cosmopolitan part. Is it? Or I don't know Italy well, but
It is, but the League, I believe, began in the North because they wanted to kind of go their own way and not have to be kind of weighed down by the South.
That's
true. Now in recent years, as the League has surged to kind of national prominence, it started to have a lot of supporters in the South as well, and it's become a kind of national movement for the whole of Italy. But it began as a kind of regional separatist movement, like, hey, let's get out of here. We're rich. We don't need
cases off our back.
Yeah, exactly. But so the last I saw, I believe, the League was polling at around 31%. That's a lot in a multi-party system with like 6 parties. So, it clearly is the leader. Now, it's not enough to get a majority of the parliament. If they had an election now, there'd have to be a coalition, which is what they had. They couldn't hold it together the last time. But if he surges into the 40s, then that would, I think, point toward some minor confirmation of my prediction. Although, you could always say, well, Italy, of course, is just now they're just reverting to their kind of innate loving of fascism.
I'm curious how you if you even noted that one of the very first things Trump said in his Thursday night speech, not the press conference on Friday that rallied the market, but the one of the first things he said, as I recall, I haven't looked at the transcript, was, we're working with our allies to address this problem. Now, first of all, it turned out to be ironic because he wound up just pissing off almost all our allies, which is the European nations who it turns out he doesn't want to see, planes flying here from. But I thought that instinct, it struck me as weird, but maybe I'm naive. I just thought, like, wait a second. What does it matter who is our allies in a military sense? In principle, all nations are allies against this virus. In any event, we should be cooperating with whatever nations share an interest with us here and can act on it. And that may wind up being correlated with who our actual allies are. But I thought, what a weird, and in some ways, it's not quite a nationalist way to think about it because it has multilateral vibes, but it's still a kind of tribal way to think about it, right?
Well, sure. You've seen this resonating throughout the right over the last couple of weeks where people are, it's not unusual to refer to a pandemic by its place of origin, but there's a kind of relishing of this being the Chinese coronavirus or the Wuhan virus. And you've seen it. I mean, I think Tom Cotton, the senator from Arkansas, made a statement the other day about how we'll have to look into this and punish the people responsible.
Well, he
for
has
this.
a whole theory that it emerged from a bioweapons lab in China. I mean, Tom Cotton is a nut and a menace.
Yeah, I know he is, but he could also be the future of the Republican Party post-Trump. He's going to be up against people like Nikki Haley on this, and
I've been cheered by seeing even people like Jennifer Rubin dismiss him and denounce him lately, because that's the milieu he emerged from. I mean, he was a product of the kind of Bill Kristol neocon talent nurturing project.
Yeah, although Jennifer Rubin is now completely. She's turned so 180 degrees against the right.
But so far as I know, not on foreign policy, which is what Tom Cotton is about, mainly from the point of view of Bill Kristol.
Yeah, but Tom Cotton is definitely from the kind of Jacksonian kind of kick some ass.
I guess that's true.
I mean, he's very Trumpian in that respect, kind of like hard. I mean, he might be. Trump has kind of weird kind of withdraw from the world instincts, whereas Cotton doesn't have
that. And if he doesn't have that, he's a pretty useful neocon asset. But anyway.
Well, he might be an asset, but
until he starts acting as crazy as he acts, at which point he may become a liability. But anyway, we digress. I wrote a piece about Tom Cotton we can link to in my Nonzero newsletter, which I might as well plug. So what were you saying when I interrupted you? You're talking about Tom Cotton.
I don't feel like I was interrupted. I don't know.
So I guess I take your point. It could well be, on balance, a tribalizing thing in the world. It will depend on how bad it gets, I guess. I don't know what's happening within Europe in terms of, I'm not aware of a whole lot of tension among nations in Europe. I mean, Britain is consistent with the whole spirit of Brexit, is kind of happy, I think, that it's an island. But I don't know of anything. Are you aware of any big international tensions there or anything?
I know that Italy has been asking for certain forms of help from Brussels and not feeling like it's getting it. At least that's what the news reporting has been saying. As always, Europe is sort of, as an idea, outstrips its reality when it comes to kind of institutional nimbleness. So, like, if we're having trouble kind of getting all cylinders firing in coordination with the rest of them, Europe is always going to have a harder time of that. So I sort of am still seeing things being very nation focused. So that Macron gives a statement, Merkel the other day had her big statement about how 60% of Germans are going to get this thing. I guess that's a lower the expectation move. Hope you sound really pessimistic and then people will end up pleasantly surprised. Yeah, well, she's on her way out. Maybe she feels like, I can say anything I want now. So I don't really see major tensions other than Italy seeming like it's struggling and not sure whether it's getting the kind of support from the core that it would prefer. But there might not be the infrastructure to provide that. I mean, is there a kind of health and human services infrastructure in the EU? I don't really know. It seems like the kind of thing that would probably still be at the national level, but
I'm sure there are bureaucrats who have that sign on their door. It's a question at the European level. It's a question, a sign like that. It's a question of how much actual power they have. I would think it would be largely regulatory.
Yeah.
So I want to briefly mention your more recent column called Coronavirus's Lessons and Limits, which to me was a reminder that you remain something of a conservative in spirit, and maybe you consider yourself a conservative in spirit. But, the argument here, correct me if I'm wrong, was we keep being fooled by progress. There is progress. There's technological progress. We get better at controlling certain aspects of our environment, but ultimately you just, shit happens. And this virus shows up, and it's an illusion to think that we can, the progress, notwithstanding its name is always good, that we can cocoon ourselves and so on. Is that fair?
Yeah. I mean, in the end, I continue to believe that there are certain things that sort of outstrip our power to control, and that we live in a culture and a world that is constantly showing us things we can control, and it's very easy to forget the fact that there are things that are beyond our reach. So, and I try in the piece to tie in a lot of things that liberals don't like about Trump as examples of this very thing, which I think might make some people scratch their head about those dots being connected exactly like that, because I think that we're living under a president who does sort of believe, and our politics for the last 3 years has sort of verified that people in our world now are within these silos that we've talked about, and they they never touch the pavement. They're sort of always floating in their kind of their cocooned world. And the one side says one thing, the other side says something else. And in the end, you can never prove the other side is wrong because we can't agree on a common shared reality or ground that we share. And that ground is ultimately bodies, mortality, the fact that, we're vulnerable, finite creatures, and that the fact that we're facing a threat to that now maybe could help to remind us that, oh yeah, like to go back to our discussion at the beginning, that, all right, we live in a world where Trump for a while was skeptical of this. A lot of people on the right until recently on Fox, Rush Limbaugh, and that whole world on the right has kind of made it seem as if, oh, this is all a hoax. This is an elaborate attempt of the Democrats to destroy the economy so they can take down Trump. They'll even destroy the stock market to bring down this guy they hate. None of it's real. Well, actually, what if the right learns, oh, it was real. This is a real thing. And it isn't just a story the other side is telling. And it's not just a story we're telling. It's the world. It's reality. It's nature and so forth.
Although people are remarkably agile psychologically and good at convincing themselves their tribe was right. I mean, Trump has succeeded time and time again, in convincing people that actually his position all along was X, Y, Z. Also, I really think and this will be on balance good news. It'll mean lives saved, but although politically, at the political level, it concerns me a little, I really think what may happen is that this won't wind up being so bad in America precisely because, largely at the behest of anti-Trumpers, we freaked out and made radical changes that wound up suppressing the contagion. Now, these are costly things we're doing economically, as we've said. So what we may get is not much death due to disease, massive economic damage, and then their line can be, see, Trump was right about the disease. You guys overreacted and sent us into a recession. Now,
exactly. And think and imagine assuming Trump loses and Biden wins. Once again, you're going to have a president coming in, having to clean up the mess from the Republicans.
Well, it actually worked out for Obama because he inherited it at the bottom and the stock market just kept going up and the economy kept growing. It relatively speaking, it kept improving.
It did, although it took a good long time to come back.
That was a tough bottom.
Yeah.
That was a tough bottom. The one, I guess one other, thing I'd say about the part of your argument in the recent piece about kind of, progress, modernization, ultimately, maybe, you don't quite put it this way, but creating problems even as it solves them and failing to stave off certain kinds. It has struck me that what you could call the technology of globalization, just this digital technology that's allowing us to see each other as we have this conversation, has really allowed us to take a lot of meaningful measures against this thing at no real economic cost. People are just working from home who previously would have gathered together in the same building. I was thinking. I personally think one overreaction actually is the actual cessation of play by athletes as opposed to just keeping the audience away, which I think is a good idea. But you can imagine if you wanted to create like sound, like the feel of the crowd, you can imagine, for purposes of the television broadcast, actually hooking up some fans on both sides and having a muted version of their responses to what's going on and even create the crowd noise. Anyway, my point is, in many ways, one enduring lesson of this, I think, will be that we can do more things without physical proximity than we had realized.
Yeah, I think that's true, and it will certainly help. I mean, I'm teaching at Ursinus College outside of Philadelphia this semester, and I'm going to have to take my class online, and I can do that. I can teach my 16 students in each section.
What software? Do you know what software you're going to use?
We're going to do it through at least the first time, try it through Canvas, which is what the campus uses for its platform for submitting papers and announcements and things. And they have a conference app that allows this kind of thing. Now, I'll do it the first time and see if it's as good as this. On the one hand, Zoom works very nicely. On the other hand, I'm a little worried that it won't be able to handle all of what it's going to be asked to do over the coming weeks. Yeah. I mean, do they have the bandwidth to handle, a whole third of the American economy trying to conduct business like this at the same time? That would be quite an achievement if they can do that.
Maybe a question of just renting more servers quickly, but I have no idea. That's another question. Do we have the total server capacity?
I have no idea. That's beyond my pay grade.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for taking the time. So where we'll at the Blogging Heads TV site, this is on the one hand an audio podcast. As video, it's both on the Blogging Heads site and on YouTube. The Blogging Heads site will have the links to these two pieces of yours we mentioned. But where else can we find your stuff? What is your Twitter handle again?
It's just at Damon Linker. And then if you go to the week, you can usually find one of my pieces somewhere on the homepage because I write 3 times a week. You can also just Google the week Damon Linker, and that'll bring you to my landing page where all my columns are found. And there are like 900 of them now. So you have plenty of reading to do if you're so interested.
Impressive.
Well, it's been about 6 years at 3 times a week. So it's
3 times a week is impressive.
Yeah, it's a lot.
And I am on Twitter, Robert Writer, Wrighter, and there is the aforementioned newsletter, the Nonzero newsletter, which you can sign up to for free at nonzero.org. So apparently, we're going to now let your family out of captivity. No, which isn't for coronavirus purposes, but because you're taping this, you've locked them in a closet.
Yeah, exactly. Governor Wolf in Pennsylvania essentially put our county on a kind of mild lockdown because we have the most cases in the state. And so, really? we do. We had, as of yesterday, we had 13. So it's still not that many.
Philly, this is like the main line?
Yeah. And I assume that's because of our proximity to Philadelphia. I don't know why else.
Well, that's a not purely blue state then that may have a real issue.
Yeah, it could. But anyway, so I joked earlier that my family is in lockdown within lockdown because I've put them away so I could do this with you without, my daughter sauntering through the living room here.
Tell them I apologize and I thank them on behalf of our
I will do so. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Damon. See you around.
Thanks for having me. Take care.